The Dreamer's Edge podcast is recorded in front of a live studio audience and edited in front of a dead one. Hi everyone, welcome to the Dreamer's Edge podcast. I'm Dimitri, webmaster of thedreamersedge.com and movie critic for AskAmen.com.
I'm Chasm. I'm an English editor with Deluxe Digital.
And today we have the triumphant return of
Dennis P. Hi, everyone.
For those of you who don't visit thedreamersedge.com on a regular basis, in October is Halloween month every year. We review horror movies mostly and horror fiction books and whatnot for an entire month. And since this is our first year doing a podcast, we've decided to do a 3-part series throughout October about the history of horror cinema. And in part 1, we're going to talk about the 20s all the way to the early 70s, touching upon the gothic roots of horror fiction, the Hammer films, the Universal monsters, and of course exploitation cinema. You're in for a treat, guys, because I know Kazan is a huge Hammer connoisseur. She goes to hardware stores all the time, buys all kinds of hammers.
She has many different shapes and sizes.
Claw hammers.
Exactly. She knows her hammers. And how to get nailed. No, wait, no.
Oh! That's a bang.
Alrighty then. So, we got a lot of material to go through. So, let's get started right away with something I like to call show and tell.
My recommendation would be Dracula, with Bela Lugosi being, I guess, the original Dracula.
Yeah.
It's true. When I was a kid growing up eating cereals, Count Chocula, that's really a version of that Dracula, really.
I find that it's one of those movies that started it all, I guess, with the monster movies.
It's certainly iconic. I think
Definitely.
when most people think of Dracula, they think Bela Lugosi.
Yeah.
They even think of the accent, which is unfortunate because it meant that people kept replicating it over time, and not well. So.
Never, yeah.
I would like to recommend Freaks from 1932, directed by Todd Browning.
One of us.
And what was interesting is Browning actually used real-life show freaks for his film. And basically, the film tells the story of these freaks who take revenge on this beautiful but gold-digging trapeze artist and turn her into a monstrous half-human, half-bird. And it's interesting simply because it makes you question what qualities make you human, what's the abnormal. So it's kind of interesting in that sense.
Do you know what year that came out?
1932.
32. Yeah, there was a lot of movies with those themes about isolation and looks, and I think that's partly related to the Depression that was taking place at the time.
Definitely.
All the economy was in the north, in the south. The real America, that's an accurate term. There's more Southern Americans than there are Northern Americans by those standards. And they felt betrayed, as if the movers and shakers isolated them and then neglected them, and they were facing the consequences of that. So all those themes about being freaks, I think a lot of Americans...
Yeah, well, it makes perfect sense because, I mean, really, the South is often demonized as this other. They're not American. They're usually portrayed as somehow grotesque. So it's kind of interesting that does come up a lot during the 30s. And later on as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Great film. Unfortunately, basically broke Browning's back. It was banned for 30 years in the UK.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was banned for 30 years. And even though he considered it one of his best, that basically he ended up retiring, a few years later because he just couldn't get any backing thereafter.
Wow.
Although definitely I would consider it one of his best.
My recommendation comes a little bit later than you guys, at the tail end of what we're going to discuss in this episode, and I want to recommend the original The Fly from 1958.
Yes. Excellent.
Very good.
Not to confuse with the Cronenberg remake in 1986, which is also a good film, but I really want to talk about the 58 movie because a lot of people know what it is, but never bother to see it. And if you can get a hold of it on DVD, I know the entire Fly trilogy, which includes The Fly, Return of the Fly in 59, and Curse of the Fly in 65. You can probably skip Return, but whatever. Are available for just $10 on a single disc. And if you can get a hold of that, rent it, buy it, for $10. That's the price of 2 rentals. Just buy it. It's worth your time. It stars Vincent Price, Patricia Owens, and David Hedison. And it stands out for me because it's one of the very first horror films and one of the rare Hammer film movies that are not as gothic influenced and more sci-fi influenced. It's one of those early cautionary tale about beware of science, which was big in the 50s. It's about an amateur scientist developing a way to do teleportation with disastrous results. The ending is truly creepy. Simpsons have made parodies of it. It's just one of those iconic, memorable moments of horror. I don't want to spoil it, but it's very much worth your time, I think.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree with that choice. It's very good. It's excellent, really.
Alright, so let's get this thing started proper. And Dennis, you mentioned that you feel Dracula was the beginning of horror. And for me, the beginning of horror is F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu in 1922. That's the one for me that started all. It's German Impressionism, and we'll see that a bit later in the next 3 episodes, but Impressionism is a huge part of the horror genre. Like Dracula, it's based on Bram Stoker's novel, but it didn't actually get the rights. In fact, all the prints of Nosferatu, except a few, were destroyed by Stoker's estate. His wife, what's her name?
Florence.
Florence.
Yeah, she was very vehement that once they actually produced the film, that all copies be destroyed because she felt it was an infringement on the copyright, which is perfectly legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, like, I wish she had seen the film.
Well, they did manage to find a few in Sweden.
True.
Yeah. So it is available on DVD. Look, it's a silent film. If you're into that, go for it. It's interesting. If you're into film history, by all means, you have to see it. Max Schreck's performance as Count Orlok, aka Count Dracula, it's not just important in the horror genre, it's important as a performance in film. If you're more of a casual horror film enthusiast, though, look, it's a silent film. It's early cinema. You can stand it or you can't.
Yeah.
But yeah, the large shadows, which were part of Impressionism, the atmosphere, that for me is what defines the horror genre. It's all in that one early film.
Yeah. No, it's true. And it's important to make the distinction that this is Nosferatu. It's not the same as the Dracula vampire type that comes later on with Bela Lugosi. He is very rat-like. Yeah, he's repulsive physically, as well in his manners. You get the sense of him being dirty, filthy, and of course, as you learn later on in the film, he is a plague carrier essentially, and he has rats at his behest who follow him around. He has all these elements that are designed to repulse the viewer. Yeah. Despite the fact he's essentially immortal, it's not something that you, as a viewer, crave, which you might get with some of the later vampire films where there's a certain attraction to living forever, to a degree. You don't really get that with Schreck's Nosferatu, and I think I like that.
Yeah, he's quite sickly.
Yeah, he is. It does really just fill you with revulsion.
That's true, and not in the same way that the characters in Twilight do.
Schreck in German means terror, doesn't it? Yeah, I'm pretty sure. It actually means terror, which is why it's kind of funny. But the actor from Nosferatu, his name happened to be Schreck.
Yeah, I thought it meant green ogre with donkey.
Yeah.
Later interpretations, folks.
Later,
yes. It's an evolving language.
What I also like about the early horror movies was the fact that they were in black and white, which added a certain, I find, creepiness, especially to the early movies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can play with shadows a lot more in black and white.
Exactly.
That you can with
It's
color.
more creepy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The thing with black and white is that the side of the screen, if you don't light it, becomes the unknown. Black and white is really good to create a claustrophobic atmosphere the way color can't.
Yeah. And it's also very good in the sense that for early films where you have certain limitations in terms of the technology that you can use.
That's right.
That's an advantage for them because it allows the viewer to insert their own sort of fears into the setting. And of course what you imagine is probably far worse than what they could have probably produced on screen at the time.
Yeah, it's sort of like child rearing that way, you know, when you tell like a misbehaving child, I'm gonna ground you. Well, that gives them one idea. If you go like, don't make me get up, you'll regret it, their imagination goes wild and then they obey. Okay, so in terms of genre, in terms of style, Nosferatu for me is the beginning of horror. In terms of commercialism, what allowed the genre to spread. Obviously not Nosferatu because all the copies were destroyed.
Yes,
that's right.
Unfortunately.
That's right.
Then we could go with Dracula, but I'm not.
Wow. So that's basically a screw you to do.
Yeah, that's right. Really appreciate the...
Yeah, for me it's James Whale's Frankenstein, 1931. Boris Karloff as the monster of Frankenstein, or Frankenstein's monster. Just not Frankenstein, kids. Frankenstein is a creator. It's Dr. Frankenstein. The monster's the monster. Anyway, again, like Freaks that you've mentioned earlier, it's about isolation, misunderstanding, and again, I think it's linked to the Great Depression of that era because, I mean, a large part of that movie feels more like Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men.
Mm-hmm. It's true because there's that sense of not just isolation but misunderstanding, right? That you had brought up, and the fact that no one really, with a couple of exceptions, really makes an effort to actually get to know the creature. It's just his physical appearance alone that's enough to turn them off, and they automatically associate disfigurement with being evil, and therefore something to be destroyed right away.
Yeah, I really relate to that, in fact.
And it's interesting because it provides a very strong contrast to the supposed hero and heroine of the film, because in comparison, they actually seem like, at least to me, as when I had first watched it, as the ones that we're supposed to abhor. Their actions seem very extreme compared to what the creature has evolved with. Part of the reason why he gets into the trouble he does is because he doesn't understand. That's not necessarily his fault. It's because no one is willing to embrace him. You know, he's always repulsed. And I think that's actually a very important thing to bring up because, as you mentioned, again with the Depression.
Yeah, that's pretty much how Southerners felt.
Exactly. That's exactly how they felt. They were being pushed away by the very people who created them, essentially, and really should be embracing them, but they're not.
And that's why the Universal Monsters, which was mostly from the 30s to the 50s, mostly.
Yeah.
Really reflected that idea. The Universal horror movies back in the day, I'm talking Dracula, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, The Creature from the Black Lagoon, and The Wolfman.
Wolfman.
Of which there will be a remake coming out very soon.
Yes.
They all deal with this idea of being misunderstood, being outside of society.
Yeah.
And I think there's a reason why they were so popular. I think people could relate to these monsters.
Well, definitely. When you find that there's no one else that you feel like you could turn to, the fact that you can relate to the supposed monster, it's kind of interesting. It's kind of revolutionary in a way, you know, at least for, I guess, for movie viewers, in the sense that, unlike, say, Nosferatu, where you don't relate to him at all, because everyone at some point does feel that sense of being displaced from the society in which they live.
And while they dealt with all of that, which were contemporary issues, back in the day, obviously not now, although, wait for it, the recession is still going.
We might see a revival. Yeah.
Exactly, a new Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah, no, Obama will fix it. I just broke a nail. Obama will fix that too. But they also kept the Gothic root. Most of them are adaptations of the Gothic novels, and that did lead to the beginning of Hammer Productions.
Yeah.
Well, they actually started in 1934. They're a UK production company that specialized in horror. They're mostly known for their success in the 50s.
Yes.
All the way to the late 60s, I guess?
Yeah, to the late 60s. Because they go bankrupt, unfortunately, in 1970.
Universal started to die down. Because, again, the 50s were a different era than the 30s. It was very positive. The US had just come out of World War II triumphant, not just in terms of we won, but in terms of we're the heroes.
Yeah.
There's no questioning the Nazis are bad guys.
Their focus shifts away from the horror more to kind of like a sci-fi sort of horror, which I imagine will
Well, because
they're more concerned with the
nuclear
scientific revolution at that point, right?
The nuclear power, right? The atomic bomb.
Yeah.
And its repercussions, or
Yeah.
So it's going in a very different direction.
Space travel is an analogy for issues with the Cold War. So the Gothic roots were really lost at that point.
Yes.
But Hammer kept them because they're from the UK, and that means they're 10 to 20 years behind. But, yeah, I'm kidding.
I would probably say it's more that they feel closer to the source material, since these are all British writers that they're...
yes.
Yeah, I would think that's it. Yeah.
I would think that might be it.
No, actually, there's also that idea that the UK didn't come out as unscathed as the US did from World War II. And so there isn't that celebration of we're the best and we're the center of the world that was really dominant in the US 50s. And so obviously that shift towards science fiction and that shift towards Cold War commentaries were not as applicable to UK culture. I think that's the real.
Well, yeah, that makes perfect sense because whereas the US economy was now starting to take off, the UK, by comparison, was experiencing a deep recession. You know, this is really their period for rebuilding.
Yeah.
And they're basically faced every day with the horror of the war. It's written on their land, really.
And what movies did they come up with? The Hammer films.
I think the beginning of Hammer as a major influence in horror is Curse of Frankenstein in 1957.
Yeah,
okay.
that's actually a good one. Yeah.
Are these considered remakes or their own story?
Well, that's actually an interesting
interesting, yeah.
Because Frankenstein, the novel by Mary Shelley, was public domain at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so they had the right to do whatever Frankenstein movie they could.
Okay.
However, you know, James Whale's Frankenstein was still a big deal. They did, I think, 3 sequels, Universal.
Yeah.
And so Hammer, which was a smaller studio than Universal, was afraid of their movie looking too much like a remake of a Whale's movie. So they went out of their way to make it different. They insert differences for apparently no reason other than to avoid a lawsuit. And it was a huge hit because Gothic really is at the core of what horror is, and fans, American fans included, really went like, "Oh, that's horror. That's what I missed."
Okay.
They appreciate it.
They appreciated it.
Yeah.
And it was such a huge success that a year later, in '58, Hammer took the time to actually make a deal with Universal, so that Universal would lend them all their monsters.
That is awesome.
Yeah. And that's what created Hammer. It's the UK taking the Universal monsters and doing it the British way, the Gothic way, with all the atmosphere and romance and repressed sexual energy.
That's very prominent in the Hammer films. Yeah. They're basically taking from what Universal has created in the 30s and 40s, and they basically reinvigorated this collection of monsters with primarily low-budget films. Like, they didn't put a lot of money that's going into it at this point. And really employing sort of sensual colors, really bloody reds, and it's very suggestively sexual in nature, more so than the other films, which is good because then it allowed them to kind of direct themselves more towards an adult-oriented audience, which is interesting because then you start to get more of the vamp sort of films coming in with the female vampire with overt lesbian overtones, like the Countess Dracula from 1970, The Vampire Lovers.
Not to be confused with Jesus Franco's Vampires, Lesbos.
That's right.
Which is a Spanish movie with a really similar title and a really similar theme, except it's a lot more explicit about the lesbian action.
Yes,
they're not even hiding it.
I know the Spanish films do tend to be that way. Chewing, moaning.
They're more open though, right? I mean, even in
well, it's because it was
culturally, right?
Well, no, I think it has more to do with the fact that it was the late 70s, and Hammer was still hanging on to a certain degree of, a tradition, what they used to do. So they're not an exploitation production company.
Yeah. That's right.
Jesus Franco had no such problem, so he just flat out made an erotic film.
Yeah, exactly. And as you were saying, it is very much in the tradition of the Gothic, in that you have characters who clearly are very sexual, but they can never really act on that, and it's very repressed, and so it always ends up being diverted towards perversion and violence, whether it be Hammer's Dracula, where you have Christopher Lee reprising the role many times,
Christopher Lee, you see him as Count Dooku in the Star Wars prequels, and you're like, oh, that dude. But you have to understand, he was a huge sex symbol in these horror films as Dracula, and that, he was sexy.
But he's also got that voice, that deep, resonant sort of voice.
Like Christian Bale's.
Where is he?
Actually, he goes, I'm Dracula.
But, I mean, really, Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, usually playing adversaries with Lee as Dracula, Cushing as Van Helsing. I mean, really, they made Hammer films.
Oh, and Vincent Price.
And Vincent Price. Oh, how could we forget Vincent Price?
The Pit and the Pendulum.
Yes, The House of Usher.
Yes.
The Last Man. House of Wax.
House of Wax, that's right. That's right. It was
Yeah, you guys, you've heard of House on Haunted Hill and House of Wax. Yeah, these are all remakes of Hammer films.
Exactly.
Yes. It's good to know.
If you thought it was original, think again.
Unfortunately, Hammer came into more and more difficulties as the sci-fi genre began to take on more place as horror. Because in the beginning 50s, horror as the science horror didn't really take off because they didn't know how to do it yet.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to bring it back to literature because Richard Matheson, famous for a lot of his short stories in horror and whatnot. For those of you who have seen Will Smith in the I Am Legend, the original story, which is nothing like the theatrical cut in spirit and in execution. But Richard Matheson's I Am Legend is actually, in my opinion, the official transition from gothic to sci-fi horror. Because what he did is he took all the tropes of vampire fiction, which is gothic in its origin, including the Garlic, like all of those. He didn't ignore any of them, and explained them scientifically. Provided science fiction explanation as to why vampires were that way. When that happened, people started realizing, oh, that's how you do science horror, because he got it perfectly.
Okay.
And from that point on, gothic was dead.
Yeah. Definitely. We saw a transition at that point with, I guess, movies like The Blob and
Them.
At that time also was the point with the nuclear power and radiation, and these movies also covered the time where they were made, where now the United States had nuclear power. The atomic bomb was used, and maybe this could also be a way of the repercussions.
That's an excellent point. The cautionary tale about use science wisely.
Yes.
Huge thing in the late 50s and early 60s.
But then my question is, from that point, how did they go into the zombies, which came right after?
So once the science fiction, as you said, became really established, we entered a new political climate. The Korean War, followed by the Vietnam War, and then the Watergate scandal with Nixon. Americans were no longer proud of being Americans. So the whole idea of cautionary tale about science, the whole idea of we have to be careful about the Cold War, turned into, hold on, my government is screwing me over. And we're back to that feeling of isolation. But this time, it's not a question of I'm being shut out by my brothers. It's a question of my superiors, the
government.
The government.
It's top down.
Yeah. So it's different from what happened in the 30s.
That's right.
And so the reaction was more a reaction of a petulant child, because the government, the parent, betrayed the child. So the child is lashing out. And so cinema, not just horror, but cinema in general, began to try to push the boundaries all the time. Erotic cinema really rose at that point. So, the first pornographic films with plot came out during that era.
Really?
Yeah. And in horror, that meant more gore, more shocking horror, all of that. And the leader of them all was George Romero's Night of the Living Dead in '68. It was, it had the modern themes.
That's right.
But it was so explicit in its gore. And it was an instant success. Midnight showings everywhere.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Huge lineups of midnight showings. It was a huge deal, and that led to the exploitation B movie.
I'll just like to add,
yes,
for people that haven't seen Night of the Living Dead, well, it is out on DVD, and they do actually even feature it in 3D. So I would definitely recommend for you guys to take a look at this movie, because it is definitely one that started, like you said, the B movies.
Yeah, one thing though, if you seek it out in 3D, be careful. There's also a remake called Night of the Living Dead 3D, which is not a very good movie at all. So be careful to check the date when you buy your DVD.
1968.
Make sure it's in black and white.
And of course, Night of the Living Dead, even though Romero keeps insisting that he wrote the part for a white person and it was cast
very
by,
important. It becomes an important social commentary, because we're talking about the civil rights movement for African Americans. So the fact that this primary character, who is resourceful, who is intelligent, who strives to survive,
and gets mistreated by white people throughout the entire film.
Exactly.
Yes.
Despite the fact that he's doing his best to make sure they live. I don't know how much further I should go without revealing something. When that thing that happens, it's a really important moment, because it highlights the fact that there's this discrepancy in terms of treatment and how people are viewed and accepted into society, regardless of whatever gifts or traits they bring to them. and that it doesn't seem to make any difference. It's heartbreaking, really, that last scene, because you're like, wow, yes, you should be uplifted at the end.
Right.
And then you're crushed. Which is, I guess, how
it reflects reality, I guess.
Exactly. That's how a lot of people felt. They were being crushed underfoot by a government that is supposed to promote equality, a betterment of life, the pursuit of happiness.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very well said.
Yeah. And by the way, that's pursuit of happiness with an I, not a Y. Take that, Will Smith. Alright, so let's get to the Electric Boogaloo Factory, ladies and gentlemen. That's when Kazim and I and our guest panelist Dennis talk about a movie that really shouldn't have a sequel, but we conceive of one anyway.
Wow.
Now, I feel that Nosferatu actually does have an unofficial sequel. I'm just saying that as an aside, called Shadow of the Vampire, that came out in 2000, which is essentially the story of the making of Nosferatu, but with the conceit that Max Schreck actually was a vampire.
Oh,
yeah,
that's cool.
It's good.
Yeah.
It's with William Dafoe. It's actually a really interesting, bizarre
John Malkovich
movie.
playing Myrna.
Very cool, very cool.
If Spike Jonze did horror, it would probably look something like Shadow of the Vampire. So now that I talked about Shadow of the Vampire, what would you guys do with Nosferatu Part 2, an official sequel?
Well, for sure, Nosferatu 2, I would keep it black and white, or I would make it black and white, just to keep it more with the original.
Would you make it a silent film?
I don't know. I thought about that too. Probably not. People wouldn't accept it.
No, they probably would not.
They would not accept it.
Yeah, I think people would be like, 90 minutes of silence while I'm just staring at the screen. Although, mind you, I did enjoy watching Nosferatu. They had this horrible soundtrack on the version I'd rented. I just muted it because it was more distracting and annoying than anything else, but it's actually very engaging. So, my Nosferatu 2, Ellen returns. She's pregnant. She gives birth to a child of unbelievable beauty, and as he grows older, charisma.
Like the kids from Twilight?
Hopefully not. As the child grows older, Ellen begins to have certain concerns. He takes to sermonizing to the small village that they live in, and he starts instituting sort of a notion of sacrifice in the village. And so she begins to see her son as a kind of like a dark Christ, really.
Dark Christ?
Yeah, a dark Christ.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm just pulling things out of my hat here. I'm not wearing a hat. I don't know why
Yeah,
I'm
we
doing
can
that.
confirm that she's not wearing a hat.
Exactly.
If
Okay.
you want a screen cap, we will show you a screen cap of nothing. All right.
Yeah, so anyway, I just have this image of him trying to create this sort of congregation of followers in this sort of new form of, I guess, Christianity that he's trying to bring.
Okay, so he's Mel Gibson then.
Ha!
The problem with doing Nosferatu 2 and why you had to go the route you did is because Arlok dies at the end of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a spoiler, come on. So for me, I was trying to figure out what the Nosferatu story was about at its core, outside of the Dracula rip.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I think Nosferatu is about real estate. Because he's a guy who hires his neighbors to find him a home and check out the home. That's how Nosferatu goes. So if I were to make a 2009 Nosferatu Part 2 movie, what I would do is that secretly a vampire caused the real estate crash of 2008
Knew that was coming.
so that he could move in next to the ladies. Because he needs the prices of housing to be cheap because he can't get a loan because, banking hours during the day.
Yeah.
And someone would have to stop this evil conspiracy of vampires, and only Obama can do it.
He takes care of everything, right?
Exactly. Get in the tree, Obama will get it for you. So it's up to Obama to bring change you can cover with garlic. Yeah, I would call it Nosferatu Part 2, Obama's Revenge.
Oh, that's good.
I guess that's enough nonsense.
On that note, yes.
Yes. So tune in 2 weeks for the next part of our brief history of Gore, in which we'll deal with the 70s all the way to the mid-90s.
Excellent.
Talk to you later, guys.